I have sat on this bench for 38 years, and in all that time, there's one case I still think about more than almost any other. It didn't just test what I know about the law, it tested what I believe justice is actually supposed to be for. Before I tell you what happened, hit that subscribe button, because this case exposed a failure in the system that quietly affects thousands of people every single year, and it forced me into a decision I'm still not entirely at peace with. It started with a number, $7,500. That's the debt an 8 one-year-old blind man supposedly owed to my city. $7,500 in parking violations he could not have possibly committed. His name was Robert Henderson. He'd been blind for 16 years. He lived alone in a small studio apartment. He survived on $1,200 a month from Social Security, and that was all he had, all he would ever have. Let me take you back to where this really began. Because Robert Henderson's story didn't start in my courtroom. It started weeks earlier in a small, bare studio apartment with no decorations, no pictures on the walls, no television. Just furniture and silence. Robert liked the radio. He liked it because he didn't need his eyes for it. He could just listen to the news, to talk shows, to anything that kept him company in that quiet apartment. His sister Margaret called him most days. "Robert, how are you?" she'd ask. "I'm okay, Margaret, just sitting here. Do you need anything? I can come by this weekend." "No, I'm fine. I have enough food. My medication is full. I'm okay." Margaret worried about her brother constantly. She had worried about him since the day he lost his vision 16 years earlier. She helped when she could, came by twice a month, helped with the bills, helped with the mail, helped with whatever he needed. But Margaret had her own family, her own life, her own problems, and she couldn't be there every single day. So most days, Robert was alone. One Thursday afternoon, mail came through the slot in his door, the way it always did. Robert had a routine for sorting mail. By feel, bills usually came in certain kinds of envelopes. Junk mail felt different in his hands. And sometimes, when he wasn't sure, he asked his neighbor to help him. This particular envelope felt thick, it felt official. So he knocked on the wall and asked his neighbor, an 87-year-old woman, to come read it to him. She opened it and went quiet for a moment. "Robert, this doesn't look good. What is it?" "It says you owe the city $7,500 for parking violations." "What? That can't be right." "It says you have a vehicle registered in your name, a Honda Civic, 37 parking violations." Robert felt his stomach drop. "I don't have a vehicle. I can't drive." "That's what I thought too," she said. "This has to be a mistake." Margaret called the city's parking enforcement office the next day. "Hi, I'm calling about my brother. He's blind. He doesn't own a vehicle. There has to be a mistake." The woman on the other end typed for a moment, then came back with an answer that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Your brother has a 2007 Honda Civic registered to his address. 37 parking violations, accumulated over 18 months. Total owed is $7,500. But he's blind. He can't drive." "That doesn't matter. The vehicle is registered in his name. He's responsible. Someone else must have used his address without his permission. If that's the case, he'll need to prove it. He has 60 days to pay, or we pursue collections." And then she hung up. Margaret was furious. She told her brother this was fraud. Someone had registered a vehicle in his name, and that was a crime. Robert had no money for a private attorney, so he applied for legal aid. 3 weeks later, he was assigned a public defender named Patricia Johnson, a woman in her 30s who had spent 6 years handling exactly this kind of case, cases where poor people got trapped in systems they never created. Patricia sat across from Robert in a small conference room and laid it out plainly. "Mr. Henderson, someone registered a 2007 Honda Civic in your name. That vehicle accumulated 37 parking violations. You now owe $7,500. "I didn't do anything," Robert told her. "I don't own a vehicle. I can't drive." "I know," she said gently, "and will argue exactly that in court, but I need to be honest with you about the law. The registered owner is responsible for parking violations, even if they didn't commit them, even if someone else fraudulently registered the vehicle in their name. That's not fair. You're right, it's not fair. But it is the law as it's written." Patricia explained the options. They could go to trial. They could stand in front of me and tell Robert's story, hope that I would understand, hope that the facts would matter more than the paperwork. But she warned him, even if they proved he was innocent, the law as written might not care. "What if I lose?" Robert asked. "If you lose, you'll owe $7,500. The city could put a lien on your apartment. They could garnish your Social Security check." "How much is my check?" $1,200 a month. "If they garnish it, how much would they take?" "Possibly all of it. You'd have nothing to live on." Robert sat there, terrified, an 81-year-old blind man, contemplating homelessness over a debt that wasn't his. "What should I do?" he asked. "I think we go to trial," Patricia said. "I think we tell the judge your story. She's fair. She listens. She might understand." "Okay," Robert said quietly, "let's do it." While Patricia built her case, she discovered something important. The signature on the vehicle registration form did not match Robert's signature at all. It was clearly forged. But she knew, even then, that this might not matter in the eyes of the law, because the law didn't ask who forged the signature. It only asked whose name was on the form. Now let me tell you about the other side of this story, because you cannot understand what happened in my courtroom without understanding who was actually driving that Honda Civic. Her name was Victoria Chen. She was 31 years old. She had been homeless for 5 years. No family to call, no job, no prospects. She'd finished high school, worked retail for 5 years, and then the store closed. Then her apartment situation collapsed. Then she was on the street. 5 years of shelters, 5 years of sleeping in doorways and public parks, and eventually in a car that wasn't hers. An acquaintance she'd met at a shelter gave her that 2007 Honda Civic. He wasn't using it anymore. It wasn't a gift out of kindness, exactly. It was one struggling person handing off a burden to another. But to Victoria, it was salvation. A place to sleep that locked from the inside. A place that was warmer than a doorway. But she needed it registered. She needed plates. She needed it to look legal, so no one would tow it while she slept. She found an address online, picked one more or less at random, and used it, Robert Henderson's address. She filled out the registration form. She signed a name that wasn't hers. It wasn't hard. 2 weeks later, she had plates. She had a legal-looking vehicle. She moved it from street to street around downtown, trying to avoid trouble, but she didn't always succeed. Over 18 months, she racked up 37 parking violations. She never paid a single one. She had no money. She was homeless. She was living in her car. The city mailed the notices to Robert's address again and again, and Victoria never saw a single one. The debt grew and grew, and she had no idea any of it was happening. She thought she just had a car to sleep in. Then, one day in March, a police officer spotted her parked in a tow zone. He ran the plates. The registration came back under the name Robert Henderson. He asked for her license. She handed him a fake ID, not with Robert's name, just a fake ID she'd made for herself to survive. The mismatch was obvious immediately. He called for backup. Victoria was arrested on the spot, charged with driving on a suspended license, possessing a fake ID, registration fraud, and identity theft. She sat in a cell, not even knowing who Robert Henderson was, not knowing that somewhere across the city, a blind 81-year-old man was being told he owed $7,500 because of her. 2 weeks before Robert's trial, Patricia sat with him one more time to prepare him for what was coming. "We'll go into court," she said. "The prosecutor will present evidence that you owe these violations. I'll argue that you're innocent, that someone else registered the vehicle in your name without your knowledge." "Will the judge believe me?" Robert asked. "I hope so. She's fair. She listens. But I have to be honest, the law is clear on paper. You're the registered owner. That makes you responsible, at least on paper. What if I lose? We'll appeal. We'll keep fighting." Robert nodded, terrified but resolved. The night before trial, Robert didn't sleep. He lay in bed running through every possible outcome. If he lost, he could lose his apartment, he could lose his Social Security check. At 81 years old, completely blind, he could end up homeless. That thought sat on his chest like a stone all night long. Now here is where I enter the story, because that Tuesday morning, Robert Henderson walked into my courtroom. He arrived at the courthouse a little after 8:30, Patricia helping him from the car, guiding him slowly up to the 3rd floor. My courtroom is not a small, friendly place. The walls are dark wood. The benches are heavy and old. There's a flag in the corner, and my bench sits elevated above everyone else in the room, the way courtrooms are built, to remind you where the authority sits. I imagine, for a blind 81-year-old man who had never been in trouble a day in his life, that room must have felt enormous and cold. The prosecutor that day was a man named David Wu. He'd been prosecuting parking violation cases for 12 years. To him, cases like this were routine. A case number, a violation, a debt owed to the city. He didn't know Robert Henderson as a person yet. He knew him as a line item. I remember entering the courtroom that morning and everyone standing, the way they always do. I looked down at the docket. City of Providence Parking Enforcement Division versus Robert Henderson, unpaid parking violations. The bailiff called the case. Mr. Wu stood first. "Your Honor, the defendant is the registered owner of a 2007 Honda Civic. This vehicle accumulated 37 parking violations over 18 months. The total amount owed is $7,500. Under city ordinance, the registered owner is liable for all violations incurred by that vehicle." Patricia stood next. "Your Honor, my client is 81 years old and completely blind. He has been blind for 16 years. He doesn't own a vehicle. He doesn't drive. He could not have committed these violations. Someone else registered this vehicle in his name without his permission. My client is the victim here. He's being punished for someone else's crime." I looked over at Robert. He sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes unfocused in that particular way blind people's eyes sometimes are. "Mr. Henderson, are you represented by counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor. This is Patricia Johnson." "Very well." Then I turned to the prosecutor, and I asked him a question I don't think anyone in that courtroom expected me to ask. "Mr. Wu, how does a blind 81-year-old man accumulate 37 parking violations?" He shifted on his feet. "Your Honor, the law is clear. The registered owner is responsible for parking violations regardless of who actually committed them." "I understand the law," I told him. "I'm asking you a practical question. How could this man have physically parked a vehicle illegally 37 times? He didn't have a good answer. "Your Honor, the violation notices were mailed to the address associated with the registration." "So you mailed notices to a blind man's address, expecting him to understand what they meant? That's standard procedure, Your Honor." I remember leaning back in my chair and saying, quietly, "Standard procedure doesn't always produce justice." I turned to Robert directly. "Mr. Henderson, have you ever owned a vehicle?" "No, Your Honor, not since I lost my vision." "Do you drive?" "No, Your Honor, I can't drive. I'm completely blind." "Have you ever authorized anyone to register a vehicle in your name?" "No, Your Honor, never." "I don't know how this happened." Did you receive any of the 37 violation notices mailed to your address? Robert hesitated. I'm not sure, Your Honor. I get a lot of mail. My sister helps me sometimes, but not always. Some mail I ask her to just throw away without reading it to me. I'm not sure if I received any of these. So it's possible you threw away violation notices without ever understanding what they were. Yes, Your Honor, that's possible. I want you to understand something about 38 years on this bench. You learn, after enough time, when a case in front of you is really about the law, and when a case is really about whether the system stopped to think about a human being at all. I stood up from my chair. I don't do that often, and everyone in that courtroom knew it meant something. Here's what troubles me about this case, I said. A vehicle was registered in Mr. Henderson's name without his authorization. That vehicle was parked illegally 37 times. The city didn't investigate who registered the vehicle. The city didn't investigate who actually drove and parked it. The city simply mailed notices to a blind man's address and then pursued him for $7,500. I looked directly at Mr. Wu. Did anyone in your department stop even for 1 second and ask how a blind man could have accumulated parking violations? He didn't answer right away. Did your department investigate whether the registration was fraudulent? No, Your Honor. Did anyone contact the DMV specifically about this case? Not specifically, Your Honor. So you pursued a blind 81-year-old man for $7,500 without ever investigating the circumstances. That's standard procedure, Your Honor. Standard procedure, I said again, is not always justice. Then I sat back down and looked at Robert. Mr. Henderson, the tickets are dismissed. You owe nothing. The courtroom made a sound I still remember, half gasp, half applause. Mr. Wu stood up immediately. Your Honor, you can't dismiss valid municipal violations. The city will appeal this decision. I looked at him calmly. Appeal it if you want, but I'm ordering the Department of Motor Vehicles to investigate who registered this vehicle in Mr. Henderson's name. And I'm ordering your office to pursue that person for the violations, not this man. I pointed toward the defense table. Mr. Henderson is innocent. He's a victim of this system, and he's free to go. Patricia touched his shoulder. Robert was crying, his whole body shaking. He told Patricia later that he had spent the entire night before believing he would end up homeless. He never expected this. I banged my gavel and called the next case, and Robert Henderson walked out of my courtroom a free man. If this were the whole story, I could tell it to you as a clean, satisfying ending. But it isn't. And if you've made it this far, please hit subscribe, because the second half of this story is the part that actually keeps me up some nights. The DMV opened a full investigation, exactly as I'd ordered. They traced the registration form. They analyzed the forged signature. They pulled traffic camera footage and identified the vehicle, watched it move from street to street across downtown, parked in a different location almost every single day, the unmistakable pattern of someone living out of a car. Using cellular data and vehicle sightings, they eventually identified the woman behind the wheel. Her name, as I told you, was Victoria Chen. She was arrested 2 weeks after Robert's trial. During another routine stop, she was charged with 3 felonies: fraud, identity theft, and forgery, on top of the driving charges from her first arrest. She faced up to 5 years in federal prison. She was also, on paper, now responsible for the $7,500 in violations that had nearly destroyed Robert Henderson. She had no way to pay any of it. She had nothing. While she sat in the county jail awaiting trial, investigators pieced together her background. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 23. Both of them killed instantly. She fell into a depression she never recovered from. She lost her job. She lost her apartment. She lost, in her words, to the officers who processed her my whole way of understanding my life. 2 years moving between shelters, then the Honda Civic, then a random address pulled off the internet, a forged signature, and 37 tickets she never saw and never paid. 1 month after I set Robert Henderson free, Victoria Chen stood in front of my bench. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like. I was the same judge who had just protected an innocent man from a debt that would have ruined the rest of his life. And now I had to look at the woman responsible for creating that debt in the first place. She was thin. She looked malnourished. Her clothes didn't fit her properly. She looked, frankly, like someone the world had already finished with. I reviewed her file in silence for a moment before I spoke. Miss Chen, you registered a vehicle in someone else's name without their permission. You accumulated 37 parking violations using that fraudulent registration. You created $7,500 in debt in Robert Henderson's name. Do you understand the seriousness of what you did? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry. Why did you do this? I was homeless. I needed somewhere to sleep. I was living in the vehicle. I didn't have any money. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I filled out a registration form using a random address. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I read through her file again while she stood there. Parents dead. 5 years homeless. No support system left in the world. I felt something for her that I don't think anyone in that courtroom expected a judge to feel toward a defendant charged with 3 felonies. But the law does not ask a judge to only feel. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, the defendant committed serious felonies. We recommend 3 years in federal prison. I looked at Victoria for a long moment before I spoke again. You know that I just helped Mr. Henderson. I just dismissed his debt. I just saved him from the consequences of your actions. And now I have to sentence you. She was crying by then. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't know him. I just needed somewhere to sleep. I know, I told her, and I meant it. I thought, sitting there, about Robert Henderson, 81 years old, blind, alone, nearly destroyed by a debt he never created. And I thought about Victoria Chen, 31 years old, homeless, orphaned by tragedy, desperate, who had made one bad choice trying to survive a situation none of us in that room had ever had to face ourselves. I thought about the city, too, which had lost the $7,500 in revenue when I dismissed Robert's case, and which would go on later that year to cut 2 positions from its parking enforcement budget as a result. I sighed, longer than I meant to, right there on the bench in front of everyone. I'm sentencing you to 2 years in federal prison, Miss Chen. You will also be ordered to repay the $7,500 in parking violations. The marshal stepped forward to take her into custody. As they led her away, she looked back at me. Your Honor, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to survive. I know, I said quietly, but intention doesn't erase consequences. If you're still with me, subscribe now, because I want to tell you what happened after both of their cases closed. And I want to ask you something I still don't have a real answer to myself. Robert Henderson went back to his small studio apartment. He avoided bankruptcy. His life materially was saved. A nonprofit that helps elderly and disabled residents heard about his case and reached out to him, offering to help him navigate the benefits system to make sure nothing like this could blindside him again. Over the following months, his situation improved slightly. He got a little more help with his bills, but he was still poor, still blind, still, most days, alone in that apartment with only the radio for company. He told Patricia, months later, that he thought about Victoria sometimes. He wondered if she was in prison. He wondered if she was okay. He wondered, quietly, whether he had won something at her expense. Victoria Chen is serving her sentence now. She has a cellmate. She's taking classes, trying to build something resembling a future for whenever she's released. But when she gets out, she will carry a felony record into a housing market and a job market that are both brutally unforgiving toward people with records. Statistically, she is more likely than not to end up homeless again. As for the city, they laid off 2 parking enforcement officers not long after Robert's case was dismissed. Response times to parking complaints in downtown nearly doubled. Illegal parking crept up. A few local business owners complained publicly that customers couldn't find spaces. None of that made the decision I made that day wrong, in my opinion. But it's part of the full picture, and I think you deserve the full picture, not just the satisfying half of it. I still think about this case constantly, more than almost any other case in 38 years on this bench. Some nights I sit in my chambers long after everyone else has gone home, and I pull both of their files, Robert's and Victoria's, and I read through them again, even though I've read them 100 times already. I remember standing up that morning in Robert's case, feeling absolutely certain I was doing the right thing. I remember the courtroom's reaction, the relief on Robert's face, the feeling that justice for once had actually worked exactly the way it's supposed to. And then, a month later, I remember sitting across from Victoria Chen and realizing that the same decision that saved one broken person had helped send investigators straight to another broken person's door. I protected an innocent man. That part I don't regret. Robert Henderson should never have been held responsible for parking violations he could not physically have committed. But protecting him meant ordering an investigation that led directly to a homeless woman's arrest and imprisonment, a woman the system had already failed long before she ever forged a signature. Was that justice? Or was it simply a judge choosing which broken person to help and which one to hurt? Because the law rarely gives you the option to help everybody at once. I wrote something in my case notes that night, and I still believe it. Justice is not always about finding the right answer. Sometimes it's about finding the least wrong one. Sometimes there is no clean answer at all. There are just people, damaged people, broken people, multiple systems have already failed long before they ever reach my courtroom, and a judge sitting up on a bench deciding case by case who gets protected and who gets punished, knowing that whichever way she rules, someone walks out of that room worse off than they were before. If you're watching this right now, I want to know something. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you think about this case, because it asks a question I still don't have a clean answer to after 38 years of trying to answer questions like it for a living. Was I right to dismiss Robert Henderson's debt? He was innocent. That part seems obvious. He should never have been held liable for crimes he couldn't have committed. But my decision is also the reason a homeless woman, a woman the system had already failed for years, ended up in federal prison. Was that justice? Or was it just a decision about which person to hurt? Here is the truth nobody likes to hear about a courtroom, and it's a truth I've had 38 years to sit with. Compassion for one person in front of you can sometimes come at another person's expense, whether you intend it that way or not. That is the actual weight of this job that people rarely talk about. You cannot help everyone. You cannot protect everyone. Every single day you make choices, and every choice costs somebody something. I chose to protect Robert Henderson that morning, and because of that choice, months later, Victoria Chen was let out of my courtroom in handcuffs. If I had ruled the other way, if I had let the law stand exactly as written, registered owner responsible regardless of circumstance, Robert Henderson would likely have lost his apartment, lost his Social Security income, and ended up homeless himself. At 81 years old, completely blind, with no one to help him. There was no version of that case where everybody walked out whole. There was only a choice about who I was willing to let fall. That's why this case has stayed with me longer than almost any other one in my career. Not because the outcome was wrong, but because there wasn't a right one waiting to be found if I just looked hard enough. There was only a decision made by one person, on one Tuesday morning that changed the entire direction of two strangers' lives, one for the better, one for the worse, and neither of them had asked to be tangled up in the other's story in the first place. So, tell me, what would you have done in my position? Would you have dismissed Robert's debt, knowing where the investigation would eventually lead? Would you have let the law stand as written and let an innocent blind man absorb a debt created by someone he'd never met? Or is there a third option I never considered, sitting up there on that bench that might have actually protected them both? I've asked myself that question for years now, and I still don't have an answer I'm fully at peace with. Before you go, subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Real courtroom decisions, real impossible choices, the parts of this job that never make it into a tidy headline. And remember Robert Henderson and Victoria Chen, two people, both victims of systems bigger than either of them, both changed forever by 5 minutes in front of my bench, one saved, one imprisoned. That isn't perfect justice. I'm not sure perfect justice exists. It's just what 38 years on this bench has actually looked like, one impossible case at a time. Thank you for listening to this one all the way through. If it made you think, or if it made you angry, or if it made you want to argue with me in the comments about what you would have done differently, good. That means it did what I wanted it to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next story. Dramatization for storytelling and educational purposes. Names, dialogue, and events have been fictionalized. This is not a record of an actual case, legal advice, or journalism.